Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Welcome. It's so good to have you join us. It's a privilege and an honor to be studying the Bible together again today. We are about to start a wonderful series. For the next 3 months, we're going to be talking about the topic honoring God. Doesn't get much better than that. We're finding ourselves in some interesting parts of the Bible, though. First 4 lessons are going to be from 1 Chronicles, an Old Testament book that we don't study from very often, so that'll be interesting. And then we'll move into 1 Kings, so we're going to be spending a lot of time in the historical material in the Old Testament, especially as it relates to King David and his son, King Solomon. And then we'll be finishing our series on honoring God by coming back to some of the gospel texts. So, you've found us on a good day as we begin this wonderful series about honoring God. David Roberts, good to see you.
Good to be back.
Good to be together today. Well, 1 Chronicles is not often preached from or taught from.
No. We're gonna be looking at 1 Chronicles. Then we'll have 1 week to talk about the birth of Jesus.
Right.
Then go back to, but it's all honoring God. So
it is. And even that Christmas lesson that we're going to have here in a couple of weeks is one that has a lot of Old Testament background to it. So that'll be interesting. Yeah. One reason that 1st and 2nd Chronicles aren't taught or preached from very often is that they repeat the historical material. They go over the same ground as we find in the books of Samuel and the books of Kings.
Right.
So we might ask the question, why would the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, include these 2 long books which are kind of repetitious?
But they come along at a later time. This was after the exile, and the perspective of the people having lost their temple, lost their city, been carried off. Now they've come back, and it's another look at history with that perspective in mind.
Yeah. So it does go over the same ground, but from a different perspective, and so it's really very helpful to read the Chronicles material parallel to Samuel and Kings.
There's much more emphasis on worship and doing things the right way, the way that God had called for it in the law.
Yeah. It doesn't ignore historical, military, political accomplishments of the kings, but it really puts the focus on their religious decisions.
And the role of priests and Levites in the process.
What went on at the temple is very important to the author of Chronicles.
Right.
Hence the religion thing and the leaders, like you're talking about. David, who obviously is the superstar of Samuel and Kings, is even more so, if you can imagine, in Chronicles.
Well, and in Chronicles, they look at his background and give the history, but they don't tell some of the bad things, some of his failures and problems in his family, but they emphasize what he did, and especially his worship of God.
Yeah. And it's not that they make up an alternate version of David, or that they don't care about the facts. The things they tell are also in the Samuel writings, but as you say, they just don't focus on the negative.
They're emphasizing
part.
the positive.
I can remember as a youngster reading a biography of Andrew Jackson and thinking what a great man he was and what amazing military accomplishments and political accomplishments. And so I had a very positive view of him. Well, finally I studied American history a little more deeply and discovered that he's a deeply flawed person, and his presidential decisions weren't always very wise and very hurtful to other people. So that doesn't mean that the biography I read when I was 12 years old was false or not fact-based. It was. But sometimes it's just a decision that historians make,
right?
One way or another. Well, we'll be in Chronicles then for the next few weeks, and you've given us a good list of emphases there. Oh, one more thing. The focus is on Judah, the southern kingdom,
Yes,
right?
right.
Not on the northern
in
tribes.
the historical time when the kingdoms split into north and south, Chronicles just pretty much ignores the north from that
Right.
point on and focuses on Judah,
So
the south.
it's more the history of the southern kingdom is what that is. Well, the background of our lesson today, which is drawn from 1 Chronicles 15, kind of picks up at 1 Chronicles chapter 13, where David, who has established a new capital in Jerusalem, wants it also to be the religious center as well as the political center of his country. And so he wants to bring the Ark of the Covenant.
It's worth
to
talking
Jerusalem.
about the ark and why it wasn't there in the first place.
Yeah.
The ark was really a box that was part of the worship, and when the tabernacle was set up, it was to be in the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. It was to have the tablets of stone that Moses had received on Mount Sinai, a jar of manna, and the rod that Moses had used.
Aaron's rod that Moses had used.
And that was to be in the ark. Later on, we'll find all that was in it was the tablets. We don't know what happened to the manna or the rod. But during the time of Saul, when the Philistines were winning battles, somebody came up with the idea that the ark was so holy and so precious and signified the presence of God among them. They'd taken into battle, and that would really be the good luck charm that would win the battle. Well, Philistines thought, something's going on, we've got to fight extra hard. They did, defeated the Israelites, captured the ark, and then they got all kinds of problems with it and decided, we got to get rid of this, put it in an ox cart and let it wander, and it went back to Israel, and they just left it at somebody's house.
Yeah.
And the ark no longer was a part of the tabernacle.
So during the time of Saul, the first king, there was terrible misuse and abuse of the ark and of its religious purpose.
Right.
Yeah. So now David wants to honor the ark appropriately, but he also wants to kind of solidify his power in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So he has this idea of bringing it back.
Yeah, the tabernacle had been erected north of Jerusalem at the town of Gibeon. And it had been at Shiloh, been at various places, but Gibeon was where it settled, but it didn't have the ark.
Yeah.
And David didn't want to disrupt the worship and move the tabernacle, but he wanted to bring the ark back and begin to move things toward Jerusalem.
Yeah. In chapter 13 of 1 Chronicles, we get the description of the first part of that journey of the ark, and it ended disastrously because they weren't transporting the ark in an appropriate and thoughtful way, and so its journey got stopped.
Someone touched it and died, and they interpreted that to be the stroke of God.
Right. So then a couple chapters later, we come to chapter 15, where David organizes the rest of the journey for the ark to bring it, and that's our lesson for today. Well, maybe I'll read this. We're kind of jumping around in 1 Chronicles chapter 15. So I'll start in verse 1. After David had constructed buildings for himself in the city of David, he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, "No one but the Levites may carry the ark of God, because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever." David assembled all Israel in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to the place he had prepared for it. Now skipping to verse 14. So the priests and Levites consecrated themselves in order to bring up the ark of the Lord, the God of Israel. And the Levites carried the ark of God with the poles on their shoulders, as Moses had commanded in accordance with the word of the Lord. David told the leaders of the Levites to appoint their fellow Levites as musicians, to make a joyful sound with musical instruments, lyres, harps, and cymbals. And now skipping to verse 25. So David and the elders of Israel and the commanders of units of 1,000 went to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the house of Obed-Edom with rejoicing. Because God had helped the Levites who were carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord, 7 bulls and 7 rams were sacrificed. Now David was clothed in a robe of fine linen, as were all the Levites who were carrying the ark, and as were the musicians, and Kenaniah, who was in charge of the singing of the choirs. David also wore a linen ephod. So all Israel brought up the ark of the covenant of the Lord with shouts and with the sounding of ram's horns and trumpets and of cymbals and the playing of lyres and harps. As the ark of the covenant of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and she saw King David dancing. Well, there's the exuberant description of the bringing of the ark to Jerusalem. And
Right.
what an event it must have been.
It was.
A great celebration.
A lot of joy was involved.
Yeah, right. Joy is mentioned, I think at least twice, isn't it?
Yes.
Verse 16, musicians were appointed to make a joyful sound, a joyful noise, right?
Loud noise, but joyful.
Yeah. And then joy is mentioned again where? Verse 25.
Yes.
They brought it with rejoicing. So this is a real celebration, and I think worthy of celebration, as the ark, which kind of symbolized the presence of God in the midst of his people, is being shown the proper honor that it didn't receive during the reign of Saul.
We'll talk in a subsequent lesson more about the details of the ark and how it was constructed and so forth. But it was almost seen as a seat for the presence of God.
Yeah.
Not that he was limited to that, but that his presence was with them.
The lid was called the mercy seat at times. Yeah, that's right. Well, David had already built his palace and some government buildings, according to verse 1. There is no temple yet, we need to point out.
Yeah.
And so the ark is going to be housed in a tent that he had constructed specifically to protect the ark.
Special tent. Yeah.
Now, when I hear the word tent in relation to the ark, my mind jumps to tabernacle, but that's not what's here, right?
That was still at Gibeon.
Yeah, okay.
And the priests and so forth were there making sacrifices, but the ark now is brought and put in a special tent in Jerusalem.
Right. So that's all there in verse 1.
It may be worth
tent.
mentioning Jerusalem and why David is moving things there instead of going to Gibeon. That's in the south. That's where that's his home area, and that's who made him king first before all of Israel joined. But Jerusalem had not been controlled by Israel. The Jebusites had it, and under David, they captured the city, so it was almost like a new territory, even though it was in the upper part of Judah. So strategically, you could say it was a capital for all Israel, not just Judah. And if David could link both the political capital with the religious, it was a unity that was desirable.
Right. It also had the advantage of being at an at a crossroads for trade purposes. So it could easily develop as an economic center, which it did.
Yeah.
So it's got economic significance, military, easily defensible, political center, and now a religious center as well. So David knew what he was doing by centralizing things in Jerusalem. And you, as you insinuated, it has the advantage of being kind of neutral territory between the northern tribes and Judah, much in the same way that Washington, D.C. was put between Maryland and Virginia as kind of a central location. So in verse 3, they begin the process of bringing the ark up. Now, there were 3 groups of leaders who are represented at this celebration. The most important group, of course, were the priests and the Levites, many of whom are mentioned by name in the verses that we skipped, verses 4 through 13. What's the difference between a priest and a Levite? Maybe we ought to describe that.
Okay, the the tribe of Levi was the religious tribe of the 12 tribes. They were the ones that were connected with worship and were not given a specific tribal area. They had locations scattered all around the country, but specifically focused on worship. But from within the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, he was the first high priest, and his descendants were to be the priests. The rest of the tribe were the workers and servants. They carried the religious articles during the Exodus and so forth. But when David had gone to get the ark in the first place, he was not as careful about the procedures. Now in chapter 15, they're making sure the Levites do the job they're supposed to. There are 2 priests that are sanctified, that they'll be in charge of things. It's all done according to Hoyle, the Old Testament law.
According to Moses,
right.
According to Exodus.
Yeah.
Okay, so the priests are in charge of the activities of worship. The Levites are in charge of the transportation, setting up of the tabernacle and all of its furnishings and worship materials. So here they're in charge. Verse 12, which we did not read, it gives the instruction to sanctify yourselves or cleanse yourselves. So there's kind of a personal preparation that goes on in the spiritual lives of each person who's going to be involved in this transportation of the ark. And verse 14, which is in our printed text, tells us that they did in fact what they were instructed, consecrated or sanctified or cleansed themselves in order to have this important task, which, by the way, verse 2 described as ministering before the Lord. The word minister there is an interesting word. It means serve, but it also means worship. So it's a specific kind of worship, service. It's not the service of a slave or a household domestic or a farm worker. It's service for the purpose of worship.
Religious service.
And we combine those terms sometimes too. We talk about a service of worship or a worship service because we want to keep those 2 notions together. And that's what the Levites are doing. Verse 15 shows us, illustrates what you were just talking about, how they gave attention to the instructions that Moses had given about the transportation. They weren't allowed to touch the ark itself.
They weren't supposed to pick it up and carry it. They put rods,
it had rings,
through rings on the side.
And then they carried it on their shoulders that way. So there is great respect for the ark. It's just they don't go over the line into this kind of magical, superstitious view of the ark, which Saul had. And which we see illustrated in the modern movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, where all that nonsense associated with it. But here there is still tremendous respect for it. And we know where that respect comes from. According to verse 15, Moses had commanded it in accordance with the word of the Lord. So for us, it's recorded in the book of Exodus, but it's the teaching of Moses as he was instructed by God at Mount Sinai.
In Exodus and then in detail in Leviticus.
Yes, that's right. That's right,
But David set up in verse 16, musicians to make a joyful or loud noise with musical instruments, lyres, harps, and cymbals. This is the first time in the Old Testament that worship is really focused on a musical aspect and not just sacrifice. You always find sacrifice in the past. Here, we find an emphasis on music.
And there is still sacrifice going on associated with which we'll get to in a minute. That's fascinating. Up until now, the way in which Israelites worshiped God was by the act of bringing something to the altar and burning it on the altar of burnt offering. Might have been grain, might have been an animal, part of an animal. But here, worship is being described as including music. Or kind of focused on music. I probably should have said there are 4 groups of leaders mentioned in this passage. We've got the religious leaders, the priests and Levites, And here in verse 16, we meet the musician, the leaders of the musicians. And then we're going to get two more kinds of leaders later on. So the leaders of the Levites appointed, the word is actually brothers, appointing their brothers, meaning their fellow Levites, as musicians. The word there for musicians in Hebrew is singers, but it's clear that it's being used more broadly to include instrumentalists. So I think musicians is a good translation. Yeah, the phrase joyful sound in our NIV text leaves out the notion of loud.
Playing loudly, yeah.
Yes. So the whole phrase implies a sound that's very loud but very joyful.
Joyful, right. Yeah.
So joyful noise might be might be one way to put it. And we see that there are two kinds of musical instruments so far. We're going to meet a third type. First we have the stringed instruments, the lyres and the harps, and then some percussion instruments, the cymbals. So leading out in music. Now, the music was so important that verses 17 through 24, which aren't in our printed text, list many of these musicians by name.
Yes.
Yeah. And three of them, we recognize their names, those of us who've read around in the Psalms a little bit.
You find the authors of Psalms.
Yeah, so Asaph is the author of 12 of the Psalms, second only to David as an author. Then Ethan. And Heman, Heman.
Yeah.
I guess you could say He-Man, right?
Yeah.
I'll say Heman. So those three who author Psalms in the book of Psalms are mentioned here as well, cymbal players. Now, verse 25 says that David had organized this festive procession to include all kinds of leaders, right? This is
when it says all Israel, obviously the entire population of the land did not come into focus in this, but all Israel's represented.
Yeah. So the elders of Israel, these would have been local spiritual / religious, political leaders probably, regional leaders. So that's kind of a political role. And then the commanders of the units of 2,000,
military.
Clearly military.
Yeah.
So he's organized quite an event here, and he's got military leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, and the music, the music area is all well represented. While we're in verse 25, I wanted to point out that the phrase Ark of the Lord has been expanded a little bit here. We have the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and that word is going to be included for the rest of our passage 3 more times. Every time the ark is mentioned, covenant. Let's do a quick reminder of the meaning of the word covenant.
Well, it's that binding commitment, connection, not contract. That's a misunderstanding. We think of that from a business perspective, but it's a sacred obligation, and it's a mutual obligation. That's the interesting thing, that when the Old Testament, Old Covenant, talks about God making covenant with Abram in the first place and with his descendants, God was binding himself to humans, which was unheard of. The idea of a suzerainty covenant, which is what it's built on, is a greater king dealing with lesser kings, and it's really the responsibility of the lesser kings. There'll be protection from the greater, but the commitment is both ways, and yet it's a greater to a lesser. That's the kind of covenant relationship we've got with God and that Israel was given, but it was so sacred that it really was the whole identity of them as a people.
Yeah, and the ark in many ways stood as a symbol of that covenant. Not only did it contain the tablets of the law, which were kind of the basis of the covenant in some ways, but it also symbolized God's presence in the midst of his people and where they sought forgiveness. Verse 26, I think, is related to that, because God had helped the Levites. God This is part of covenant, right?
Yeah.
God helping his people, and in this case, helping them do this very important act of moving the Ark of the Covenant. Now, verse 26 ends with a mention of the sacrificing of bulls and rams.
Right.
So that's still a central part of their activities of worship as they go. There's a reference to the clothing. Everybody was dressed up for the occasion, wearing a robe of fine linen. David wore it, the Levites wore it, the musicians wore it.
Yeah.
And then a linen. Why the reference to a linen ephod at the end of 27?
That's a typical garb of priests.
Yeah.
And David apparently was dressed that way, even though he was not a priest.
Not a priest. He's not wearing royal robes that are different. It's interesting that he isn't differentiated from the others in what he wears. He's deliberately dressed
Identifying
like
with
the
the
others.
priests,
Yeah. So all Israel brought up the Ark of the Covenant with their shouting, and here we see there's some wind instruments as well as cymbals and lyres and harps. There are ram's horns and trumpets, and the ram's horn, we know that Hebrew word, the shofar, becomes famous from the Battle of Jericho days.
Yeah.
Back in the book of
And the trumpet was
Joshua.
apparently a straight instrument that had been used more with battle times and so forth, but
military
connected to worship now.
Yeah.
It's interesting talking about the clothing, that David's clothes are mentioned here in 2 Samuel. He danced before the ark and didn't have much clothing on.
Yeah. The emphasis is on his lack of clothing, and that's what led to, in part at least, to his wife's despite toward him during this time. I don't want to dwell on it because we don't have much time left anyway, but verse 29 in our printed text mentions Michal, David's wife, daughter of the previous King Solomon, looking out her window as they brought the ark into Jerusalem. It's a little bit odd that the lesson preparers included that verse at all. It doesn't really add much to the story of the celebration. But what's especially odd is that they don't give us the whole verse.
It says that she despised him in her heart.
Despised him. And here it sounds like she may have despised him because of his decision to make a big fuss over the ark. It's clear from 2 Samuel that she despised him because of his outlandish display, near naked
exhibitionism.
Display. At any rate,
but apparently from 1 Samuel, when Saul was allowed that ark to go into the battle, it shows a disrespect for the ark, and that may have been her family background.
Yeah, Michal may be carrying that over. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We've learned an important lesson about worship, that no matter what the activities of worship or the materials of worship or the instruments of worship or the furniture of worship, what's most important is the attitude in worship. And we see here from this event, it's joy. We hope that you can take joy into your week and focus on the upcoming worship along with us. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again real soon.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.